obey God in everything. And so he sets this wonderful example for us. Now, what had happened in our last visit to the book of Acts, Paul had returned from his last third missionary journey, and he had kind of like, the swallows return to Kappa, whatever that is. And we see the geese flying south, and they just have this desire, this innate pulling to go to wherever it is they're supposed to go. And Paul had that same kind of feeling, knowing that he had to go back to Jerusalem. So this is where he was when we had left him last. He had come back to Jerusalem. He was bringing some money to help support the church in Jerusalem, who were going through some hard times from some well-to-do people from Macedonia, and some of them were traveling with him. Little commotion was going on there because there were people that were opposed to Paul, and they showed up before, a long time before this. He refers to them as some Jews from Asia, but I'm sure that there were more than just that particular group. But this is the group that starts to stir up trouble again here in this context, when Paul, who had gone to the temple, had made a vow to go to the temple. He had cleansed himself. He was doing everything according to the law, but these false accusations were brought against him, and they were spreading this rumor that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. Now, that would have been a very serious offense. In fact, had he done that, he could have been killed. So what's really behind this? Well, we're going to see that there are some similarities between Paul and how people were reacting to him, as similarities to how people were reacting to Christ, and how they had these plans to try to deal with him. So that's kind of the setting. Now, if you'll recall, he was brought at that time before the Sanhedrin, before the leaders in Jerusalem. And at that time, it was kind of a matter of just trying to straighten this whole thing out, these accusations. And Paul had addressed them. First, the accusations were brought against him, and then he had the chance to respond. And in his response, this part you might remember, he sort of pitted the Sadducees against the Pharisees by talking about how he believed in the resurrection. Now, these two factions within the Jewish leadership did not agree on that. And the bottom line is that started a riot. And it's almost funny. I mean, maybe it's not funny, but it's just curious that this supposedly august, high-ranking leadership within Israel are lording it over Paul, trying to pass judgment on him. And I think maybe this is God's sense of humor, but they themselves didn't agree. And they got to the point where they were fighting with each other, and it got so bad that the Roman authorities had to step in and pull Paul out of there because they were ready to kill Paul. I mean, it's kind of a crazy situation. So long story short, they learned that there's a plot to try to kill Paul. Remember, his nephew comes in, and we get the impression that this was just a young child that had come in to reveal this plot. And Lysias, the Roman commander, who was more or less in charge of things there, took note of that, and as a result, he pulled Paul out of Jerusalem. They snuck him out of there with this armed guard of hundreds of soldiers, and they took him to Caesarea. And his interest, I think, was primarily to preserve the peace in Rome. The Romans didn't really care what you believed theologically. You could believe anything you want as long as you didn't cause trouble. But this was causing trouble, and so Lysias was the commander, and he packed up Paul and snuck him out because there was this oath that these people had made. 40 men said that they were going to kill Paul, and they wouldn't eat or sleep until they did. I'm not sure how it all turned out for those guys, but obviously they failed in their attempt. Paul was whisked away, and he was brought to Caesarea. Now, the difference between Jerusalem and Caesarea is like extreme opposites, because Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish faith. It's this holy city, and all the Jewish leadership was centered there. When it comes to the Roman presence in Judea, Caesarea was the place. And Herod the Great was, very much in tune with the Roman mindset, and he built this elaborate harbor and this whole city to accommodate the Roman presence in Israel, in Judea. And it's kind of interesting. I was really glad that when we were in Israel, we got to see, I guess you could say, what was left of that. But there was this big arena that they used to have horse races in, and then there was a theater that they actually sort of rebuilt and were using. But you get the sense that this was a very special place. You could see the remnants of what used to be the harbor and some big warehouses. But this was, politically speaking, the opposite of what was going on in Jerusalem. And it was these two powers within Israel that were represented by these two different cities. So they whisked Paul off to Caesarea, and some Jewish representatives were required to go to bring charges against Paul there. When you have court cases, they spend a lot of time talking about where do we want to try this particular case, because, the place that you try it might be significant in terms of what kind of results you would get. So that was the case here, because now it's out of the hands of the Jews, who would have just crucified Paul immediately if they could have, and now it's in the hands of the Romans to make this decision. What do we do with this guy? And this whole issue of this Nazarene sect that seems to be causing so much trouble. Okay, that's the background. Now let's read from, and this is all in Acts chapter 24, and we'll try to get through the whole chapter. I'm not sure if we will or not, but we'll at least skim over it. I want to say, what I want to do today is look at the context, establish the setting, and then next week look at one particular thing and try to imagine what it was that Paul said in his defense. We'll get to that. I'll explain that later. But we start out. 5 days later, the high priest, Ananias, went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. They brought their charges against Paul before the governor, that would be Felix, and when Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. I have to stop here and say, Tertullus did not mean one word that he said. This is what lawyers do. They make people feel good about themselves. They make you think that you respect them. But in reality, Felix was one of the most hated people amongst the Jews. And actually, Ananias himself didn't do much better in terms of respect from the Jewish people. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. Okay, so this is the setting. So now you've got all the characters that are involved in this. You've got Felix, and he is the governor of Judea. They would appoint them, I think it was for 5-year terms, and they, Rome would decide who's going to govern each province. And the curious thing about Felix is that he was actually born a slave. He was the first slave ever to become a governor in Rome. I mean, that's pretty significant. And so he had this unique reputation. He was actually married 3 times. We don't know who his first wife was, but we know that his second wife was the granddaughter of Anthony and Cleopatra. You ever heard of them? I mean, this is like one of those marriages with a political motive to it. We don't even know the name of his first wife, but we know his second wife was the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra. So I just, the word trophy wife just comes to mind for some reason. I don't know why. His third wife is Drusilla. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa. And I'm thinking, political motivation for these marriages. Drusilla was also, and I think this might have been part of God's plan, was also Jewish, because obviously if she is the daughter of Herod Agrippa, obviously she is Jewish, and she knows a lot about what's going on in Israel. Felix was also ruthless in his rule, like a lot of those Roman governors were, and he was described as a king having the power of a king with the spirit of a slave. And I was going to ask Suresh, because I know there's a verse, but I found it in Proverbs. This is Proverbs 19:10. It is not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, how much worse for a slave to rule over princes. I mean, I had to read that verse because this was basically Felix. He wasn't one of these born and bred Roman type leaders that went to all the proper schools. He was made governor because his brother had some contact with Nero and found favor in Nero's eyes. So this is all a bunch of politics going on. So you have Felix, you have Tertullus, and I think we pretty much summed up who he was. The Jews, knowing that they were to present this case in a proper protocol before the Roman government, hired this guy Tertullus. Now, he doesn't show up, as far as I know, anywhere else in scriptures, but he's just playing a little role here, and he is the one that acts as a go-between between the Jewish leaders who hated Paul and Felix. Of course, their whole goal is to try to get rid of Paul. And you see the similarities between that and those of Christ. When these Jewish leaders were in the same boat, they didn't have the legal authority to crucify Christ. They had to go through Rome to do it. So you have exactly the same dynamics going on here, is that the Jews are trying to manipulate the Romans, and the way they do it is basically by lying and making up these stories. The last person that is involved in this is Ananias, and he's the high priest of Israel. Very much like Felix, he was ruthless, he was corrupt, he was hated by the Jewish people, and eventually he was assassinated by, this is the high priest of Israel, and he's assassinated by the Jewish people because of his political bent towards Rome. And this is kind of interesting to me. Most likely, Ananias knew about this plot to kill Paul. I mean, maybe he instigated it, I don't know, but I'm sure he put his stamp of approval on it. And when you think about his position as the high priest, isn't there something in the law about thou shalt not kill? I mean, I'm a little fuzzy on that, but I think it says something about thou shalt not kill. This is the high priest. I put that in quotes because by this time, that position was totally political. It had nothing to do with anything spiritual. But nevertheless, maybe there's a little irony there. But he is supposed to be the high priest, and yet he is perfectly fine with making up all these stories, with bringing these false accusations against Paul. And really, if he could have, he would have had him killed. So we're not seeing a lot of spiritual integrity in this guy. And as Suresh was reading that passage, about from Ezekiel, I probably don't need to read the one I had because it says that this is how bad Israel had become as a nation. But another passage in Isaiah, Jerusalem staggers, Judah is falling. Their words and deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. And that's really Ananias. And that was, in this case, Isaiah was talking about the nation of Israel, But you see exactly the same thing, this lack of any kind of spirituality and this focus just on having power and, whatever you want to try to grab in this world. So what were the accusations? Starting in verse 5. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and they even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about these charges we are bringing against him. And I think the irony is that Felix in Rome in general didn't really give any concern to what you believed in terms of your religion. And, he kind of concludes by saying, this is just a bunch of religious arguments amongst these people, and it means nothing to Rome, but they find it necessary to try to manipulate Felix so that they can, get rid of Paul. So they said he's a troublemaker. He's stirring up riots. I think the irony there is that Paul was never stirring up riots. He was simply preaching the truth, and as a result, it made a lot of people angry, and it was the people and their response to the message that started these riots. It wasn't Paul. That wasn't his purpose. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Now, that was probably true. That was, an accurate statement. But then he even tried to desecrate the temple. This is where it gets into a total lie, a total fabrication. And it's the interesting thing about that is that the Romans would have allowed somebody to be killed if they desecrated the Jewish temple. That was kind of an agreement, I guess, that they came up with. So this would have been a great thing to be able to prove because it would have made it possible to legally kill Paul. The only problem is it wasn't true, and when Paul gets up to respond to this, he just simply denies the fact that, this ever happened because it didn't. But there are these similarities. We think about Christ and how he was treated exactly the same way. I'll just read one passage from Luke 23, describing, these charges that they brought against Christ. And then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. Now, the last statement was true because he was Messiah, the king. But he never said anything about not paying taxes to Caesar. In fact, we know the story. You know exactly what he said. Whose image is on the coin? It's Caesar. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar. He never opposed that. But they wanted to characterize Christ as being a threat to Rome, whereas he really wasn't. And then you have the whole discourse with Pilate, and you see how Pilate himself washes his hands of this whole thing, or tries to. But he had to make the Jews happy, so that was the only reason he agreed to the crucifixion. And this is where I think we need to be mindful of what can happen to a nation. And I think that was part of what Suresh was saying in prayer, that if you look at America and the history of America, the Bible has always been the good book. And not that every American always obeyed the Bible, but they held it in high esteem because they knew it was the truth. And now you almost get the sense that a lot of people feel the Bible is a dangerous threat. And I suppose when you consider what this grain of contemporary thought is, yeah, the Bible is a threat to that. So you've got this clash now, and it's really kind of the same dynamics, spiritual dynamics that were going on back then. Now, Paul speaks in his own defense. The governor, and this is starting in verse 10, when the governor motioned him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, and I gladly make my defense. Now you notice how Paul doesn't try to butter him up. He doesn't, oh, most gracious Felix, or nothing like that. He just says, I'm just glad I'm here so that I can make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, and he's kind of telling his story so that he can kind of fill in Felix as to where he's been. I went to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. That's absolutely true. He never did any of that stuff. They were the ones that actually started the riot. I mean, that's the irony there. And they cannot prove to you the charges that they are now making against me. And that's another interesting thing. But the actual people that were making these charges against Paul didn't bother to come to Caesarea. They sort of stayed back in Jerusalem. So now it's in the hands of Tertullus and Ananias to try to bring these charges. However, verse 14, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves had, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, basically referring to his missionary journeys, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple. Remember, he bent over backwards to make sure he did everything according to the law, and that's why they had encouraged him actually to do that, to be like a testimony to his obedience and faithfulness to the law of Moses. When they found me in the temple courts doing this, there was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia, these are the guys that he particularly points his finger at, who ought to be here before you now and bring charges if they have anything against me. These guys brought all these accusations. They stirred all this stuff up, but they didn't even bother, and I'm not sure why, to come to Caesarea to follow through with their accusations. I'm kind of guessing is that because they knew if they actually stood before a court who is operating in the realm of logic and tell us the truth, that their story wouldn't hold up. Probably that's why they didn't go to Caesarea. Or these who are here should state what crime they have found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence, it's concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial for you today. And that's kind of interesting. I thought that was curious that he kind of sent that whole trial before the Sanhedrin in that direction by simply stating that I believe in the resurrection. And of course, that was the spark that set off this whole disagreement between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And if you'll recall, the Pharisees actually said at that trial, we find no fault in this man. Those words came out of their mouth. And, what if he has some vision from the Lord? We have to remember when we speak of Pharisees that this is a bunch of different people and that there were really all kinds of, ranging from hatred to actual believers in Christ amongst the Pharisees. So you have to be careful when you just use one word to describe a lot of different kinds of people. But the Pharisees at that point, or some within that group, said there's nothing, there's no charge we should bring against him. He should just go free. But the Sadducees spoke up, and the riot occurred, and now this is where he's at. So he points to that resurrection, this issue of the resurrection. And now what was really behind that when you talk about resurrection? It was the resurrection of Jesus Christ, obviously, because this is the whole thing that is the dynamic behind this whole movement, the sect of the Nazarenes. that there was somebody who actually rose from the dead. And who can do that unless he is God? You know, you can try to heal people with medicine and, you know, do the best you can, but who can raise somebody from the dead? Only, well, you know, Jesus himself did that before, so there is reference to that power that was manifest in him, but speaking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that was really the issue, and I think it was the issue that caused the Jewish leaders themselves the most concern, and maybe you could even say the most fear, because they had to deny that. If they didn't deny it, they would have to acknowledge it, and then, you know, what's left in their argument against Christianity. Now we get to the results, and it's kind of interesting how this whole thing ended up, because when you have a trial, what is it that everybody waits for? They wait for the judge to come out and, you know, open up his little notebook and read the sentencing. Well, whatever the jury decides. This is guilty or not guilty. And, you know, that's always in any TV show about a trial. Now, that's always the big climax, and the judge comes out, and he reads the result of the jury's decision. And then eventually the sentencing comes. That's another stage that they go through. So what was the decision of the jury? There was no jury, obviously. This was actually more of a hearing than an actual trial. But Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, this is verse 22, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. Which is kind of interesting, because as far as we know, Lysias, I don't know if he actually did show up, but you never hear about any particular exact decision in this case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard. He couldn't just let him go, because he hasn't decided yet what to do with him, but to give him some freedom and to permit his friends to take care of his needs. So that was just God's providence. You know, what is this? These are things planned from ages ago, long ago. This was all part of God's plan from the beginning. So now Paul finds himself in a situation where when he was going to Jerusalem, I mean, everybody said, don't go, they're going to kill you. And he said, I don't care. Just like Jesus when he went to Jerusalem. I just have to go for whatever reason. And he was ready to die then. And I think maybe Paul was a little bit surprised, thinking when they were ready to kill him, the Sanhedrin was ready to kill him, and then this Roman commander swoops down and saves him, and he's thinking, I'm still alive. What's going on here? You know, what is God going to do? He might have easily thought this is the end of, you know, I did my journeys and now I'm ready to go home. But God's not done with him yet. And I think that's, you know, kind of an exciting thing to see now, how God literally steps in and saves him. So several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him, you know, so he's not giving any verdict yet. I don't know if Lysias ever showed up or not. And he listened to him as Paul spoke about faith in Jesus. Now, here's the thing we want to look at next week. What is it that Paul says to Felix? And it gives the answer right here in the next verse. As Paul talked about, hey, now we've got 3 more letters, R, S, J. Righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Now, we don't know the specific words that Paul used in this context, but we do know basically what the subject matter was. And it's interesting to see Felix's reaction. That's enough for now. You may leave when I find it convenient. I will send for you. And at the same time, he was hoping Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. And, you know, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Festus, and that kind of gets into our next chapter. But I think it's interesting that it made him uncomfortable, the things that Paul was saying. And doesn't the truth make people uncomfortable? It said he had fear. It caused him to fear the things that Paul was saying. And yet he had this strange kind of maybe an approach avoidance thing. In a way, he wanted to hear Paul's message, but at the same time, the truth made him tremble in fear. And I think this is why people like Felix, who have this, they're basically despotic leaders, and they think that they are God and that they are totally in control of everything, and they have no room for the idea of God in their lives. Yet deep down in, they know that what they're doing is wrong. I think they have to, because the laws of God are written on our hearts. And I think coming back to our world today, we have seen how these types of despotic leaders, who is the first people that they go after? You can think of World War II and the Nazi situation. Who were the first people that they went after? It was anybody who named the name of Christ, challenged their authority. What happened in communist Russia under Stalin? Same thing. What's going on in North Korea? Exact same thing. It's a pattern that's established, and it's just part of the way things are. One of the things that we've noticed, we've been going through the book of Acts simultaneously in our Saturday, what day is that? Wednesday morning Bible studies at Wegmans with coffee and donuts. And it's just amazing. As you go through the whole book of Acts, you see the same things going on and on again, and they're repeated in our world today. It's the same spiritual battle, and it's exactly the same thing. So it's kind of interesting that going back to when Paul was first called, there's another guy named Ananias. There's 3 Ananiases in the scripture. Gets a little confusing, but the other guy was the one who introduced Paul to the church. And back in Acts 9, you remember he said, "I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm that he has done to your holy people in Jerusalem." This is Acts 9:13 through 15. "And when he has come here with authority from the chief priest to arrest all who come in your name, but the Lord said to Ananias, 'Go, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. And I will show him much he must suffer for my name.'" This is before Paul did anything. This was before Paul was Paul. And he just comes after this experience on the road to Damascus, himself kind of scratching his head as to what's going on. And the Lord gives this insight to Ananias. And what we're reading now, what we're seeing going on now in Paul's life, is the fulfillment of this prophecy, that he will proclaim my name to the Gentiles. And as his, remember, as his journey went further and further into Gentile land, that's exactly what happened. And they're kings. And by this time, Paul had already been brought before a lot of the local rulers and leaders because of what was going on. And now this is kind of the climax, and he's stepping up a notch, going from a lower court to a higher court. And eventually, God brings him to Rome itself. So it's just fantastic to see. This is the power of God putting fear in the hearts of men. And it was the same fear that those Jewish leaders had when they insisted that Christ go to the cross, that was the only solution they had to deal with him. And we find out that today, when you boldly speak the truth in the name of Christ, you will get the same reaction. And I think as Suresh was praying, that was that prayer, that we would have the courage and the spiritual insight to speak boldly in the name of Christ, to speak the truth. And you don't have to stand before kings to do that. You know, we do it with our family. We do it with our friends. We do it by our own testimony and living that life that the world will recognize as being a righteous and holy life. So what we want to do next week then is look at those three things, the idea of righteousness, of self-control, and judgment, and imagine, I mean, we don't know what Paul said then to Felix, but we do know what Paul said about those things. And I'm thinking that by this time, Paul was probably had his sermons all lined up and, you know, had them all developed after 3 missionary journeys, and that probably what he said to Felix was very much in line with what he writes about in his other epistles. So we're going to kind of switch from just looking at the historical circumstances to looking at what Paul was teaching about those very important subjects and thinking about that he's talking to Felix. How did Felix respond to this? And how should we respond to it? So it's been a blessing to look at this particular portion. And I mean, I know it's a lot of history and a lot of names and stuff like that, but it's still exactly what is going on in the world today. It's just an accurate picture of what has always been the case. Brother Suresh.
I'm beginning to appreciate more of the Word of God. And every time I see it, it is so rich. Satan may have a plan to destroy us. And as he was sharing different scriptures, God brought to my attention Psalm 64, 4 through 8. And where it says, they have devised a clever plan, and they think they have caught you. But 7 and 8 says, God will shoot at her, and God will take care of it. And here again, when Paul was speaking, there's another thing. Truth will confront. In 2 Corinthians 13:8, you can do nothing against the truth, but for the truth. There is a response needed. And so we see that's what Felix also said, and as Lowell was focusing on that passage where he said about righteousness and judgment, he was afraid. Who should be afraid? The prisoner should have been afraid, but the judge is the one who's afraid. Isn't that opposite? Because they had the Spirit of Christ. In Acts chapter 2, what happened when they were convicted in Acts 2, 36 and 37, they screamed, but they responded. What did they do? Now I should say 2:37. When they heard, they were cut through the heart. The Spirit of God spoke. And today, as the Spirit of God is speaking to us, let us respond to God. And we see one response is humility. The other response in Acts 7:56, what did they do? They threw stones. So there's two types of responses. Submit, surrender, invite, and live for God, or you can throw stones. You may throw the last stone today, but one day every knee is going to bow. So when we really look at this, as Lowell was bringing this out again and again, another thing we saw, a window of grace in Acts chapter 2, when Lysias the commander, it says in Acts 2:22, 24:22, and he said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision. But he commanded the centurion in 23, a window of grace. What is that window? He said, Paul can have company. That is the window of grace God gives us all. Isn't that beautiful to see? And there it also, I'm sure Lowell is going to speak on it next week, that who was afraid? Felix was afraid. Who should have been afraid? Paul should have been afraid. Another passage which comes to me, Matthew 10:28, fear not him who can touch you, but fear him who can touch your soul and body in hell. You can go there and make a decision. So as a benediction, I want you to look at Hebrews 13, 20 and 21. Let us read it together. Let's stand, let's read it together. As loud as we can. There are enough people here. So I want to hear every voice. Let's read it together. You prayed it, you read it, you will be held responsible for it. God bless you. I'm glad you are here. Take time to fellowship. We're so blessed to have each one of you here. God bless you.